Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for taking some time to learn more about the science of reading, especially at the middle and secondary school level with Dr. Katie McKnight. I'm super excited to be here with Katie, who has been a very close friend for many years after first meeting Katie in Chicago Public Schools, where I was the director of curriculum and instruction for 115 schools, right around the time we were rolling out new standards, implementing RTI for the first time, which is now often called MTSS, and a growth assessment map, NWEA map, to 111,000 students and 10,000 teachers. And during that time, I stumbled upon Katie's work and started engaging Katie to train our teachers. And since then, we have been collaborators. She's been a thought partner from the very beginning with Think Circa. And I am super excited to have this conversation today because she's been off writing dozens of books, and I've been off building Think Circa with our partners, and trying to address needs as they arise. And we're here today to talk about how our work is crossing paths again as we implement our secondary reading literacy supports, which I will show at the end of this webinar so you understand what we have available here. But I think today, given the huge number of attendees and the enormous number of questions that came in, we're going to do our best to try to address that. So I want to start by just giving Katie some time to talk through her experience and her biography, and then we will jump into those questions and answer as many as we can live. We will certainly answer everything before this is over in writing and in blogs. So feel free to keep the questions coming as we go. So with that, Dr. McKnight, how about sharing a little bit more about your background?
Well, my friends and family call me Katie. So we're among friends and family and colleagues. So please call me Katie. As Eileen mentioned, that's how we met. We've known each other now for over a decade, and which is kind of hard to realize at this point. But, like many of you, I'm in my 35th year as an educator at this point. I was a classroom teacher, middle school, high school, earned my PhD along the way. And I've authored now, I'm working on book number 23 right now. And so clearly I have a lot to say. And then I also was at the university for 15 years. And about 9 years ago, I decided that I was done with university life. I was a full professor. I earned all the badges that you can earn in that program, I guess, or that journey as a professor, and started, really just focusing on working in classrooms and in schools to foster change and improve student performance and literacy. As we all know, as we're all aware of how drastic it truly is, and paying attention to this topic. So the good news is that what we're going to share with you, that once you have the knowledge and you know what the what is, it's really not that challenging to implement. It's more of the changing of habits, which are always the hardest part, than the knowledge and actually really pragmatic way of approaching it. So that's always the hard part, is changing our habits, without a doubt. So that's it on me. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that very short bio. You can definitely look up Dr. McKnight and her work at National Louis and the many teachers she trained across the country, and a huge following who continues to learn from her. And that includes us. And so one of the things I wanted to just kind of set the stage before we dive into some very, 101 kind of conceptual framework sharing here, is that I want to set the stage for the why behind this webinar. So first of all, I think we saw at the beginning of the shutdown back in 2020 that as educators, and all of us who are educators know, we can do anything. When we decide to do it, we can get it done. And so overnight, we all became remote learning experts. We started using technology we had never used before. We learned how to keep kids engaged in really distressing circumstances. So Like any challenge, I don't see the science of reading challenges that are facing you as a teacher or a leader who's maybe hearing about legislation coming your way or being, following and complying with new mandates. I don't see this as a problem that is insurmountable by any means. And what I'm really excited about is that we know that in this more evolved world of blended learning, that the big challenges of diverse learners, which has always existed. Maybe we didn't know it as much before because we didn't have the data we do now. The big challenge of diverse learners and the teacher capacity, just human time and energy and skill and knowledge to be able to kind of meet those needs, that's always been a challenge. Post-pandemic, we have students who are coming in who had several years, 2 to 3 years, in some cases, of very disrupted, if not absent, educational access for parts of that time. And as a result, they have not just the diverse needs that they have, but they have bigger gaps. And so if you are a 6th grade teacher, you may be welcoming students to your classroom who have not mastered basic foundational reading skills like decoding, right? On the flip side, there was also a massive reduction in teachers and retirements and people leaving the profession. And so we also are meeting those larger needs and very diverse gaps with teachers who are hopefully passionate about being in the classroom and have chosen this profession and may not have as many experiences or certification, et cetera, that we would be typically seeing, 4 or 5 years ago. But also, I think in general, secondary teachers have been content area focused. And so we haven't necessarily prepared them to be teachers of reading. And so again, there's one group of people I would always trust to handle a really big problem, and that is teachers, because I know that we figure it out. Who else can move hundreds of students through a building in an orderly fashion in 4 minutes or less and still make copies and, go to the bathroom?
It's so true.
So I'm going to hand it over to Katie, who's going to kind of give us that framework and that sharing, and just to say that, we're going to show you things that, once you have that understanding, we're also going to show you what Think Circa has implemented to make it actually doable. And that's something else we'll talk about, like the importance of making things doable.
Yes. Yeah. Being pragmatic. You can tell that Eileen and I were both classroom teachers. It's gotta be tenable, I gotta have my Saturday night. So here's what we're going to look at. First of all, so basically what I'm going to share with you right now is a 16 week college semester graduate level course on adolescent reading comprehension in about 5 minutes. Because we're all really, really smart, because we're teachers, we're educators, so we're super smart. So we're gonna just go through it. There's right now, as we know, the whole idea of the science of reading is not new. It's over half a century old. Reading as an area of study emerged from psychology, the field of psychology, back in the 50s. Post World War II. And then, of course, it just accelerated, particularly in the 70s and onward. And there have been, I'm sure you've heard of the reading wars and the battle between different approaches to the teaching of reading. And what science of reading does is really gets down to the bare bones of what does the research, what does the evidence that is presented in this mega body of research, what has it been telling us in the last 50 years. And of course, now what we know too in neuroscience, particularly in the last 15 years, is pretty nerdy and geeky, because it just keeps reinforming what we know about reading processes. So the first thing to start off is that human beings are not equipped for reading. We're not naturally hardwired for reading. It's kind of a cool factoid. So the fact that we've developed being able to read the written word is actually a phenomena that's happened. And then it particularly accelerated in the 1600s with the invention of the printing press. So here's what we need to know. There's basically two reading approaches or reading theory models du jour. And one of them is the simple reading theory, and then the other is Scarborough's reading rope. And I bet many of you have heard of Scarborough's reading rope. I want to briefly talk about it and what it means for us as teachers of adolescence, as educators of adolescence, because there are some distinct differences. The way that we teach comprehension and reading is related, but yet different than what it is for little people, for our little guys. So that's what I'm really going to emphasize. And that's where my passion and my work as an educator has always been contextualized, is in the role of the raging hormonal pubescence. Those are my people. All right. So think of, yeah, Eileen has a penchant too for the raging hormonal adolescents too. We love them. And so here's what the reading rope is. So there's basically two strands, just like you have on a rope. And so we have two main areas. One is that word recognition. The other is that language comprehension. And they keep intertwining and intertwining and intertwining as you go through school, and it gets tighter and tighter and tighter till you get to that skilled reading. Well, little people, that's what we really focus on, is word recognition, phonological awareness, decoding, sight recognition. So sight words, as well as being able to understand that CH means ch and ING is ing, all of those things. So kids learn how to decode with automaticity. Dan Willingham, who I'm a big fangirl of, he is a professor of psychology, cognitive psychology out of the University of Virginia, and he's documented quite prolifically about that once you can decode anything. So our issue is oftentimes in middle school and high school is the kids can decode, they go near across the page, and you say, hey, what's the author's message? What's the theme? What can you infer about the text? And the kids look at you and go, they have no idea. And that's where that top part, the language comprehension, comes in. So if kids are not still effective with their decoding at this level, that's another issue. So I'm talking about kids who can decode. If kids can't decode, then that is an intervention that we need to talk about. That has to be a strategic intervention. But the vast majority of our kids are in that language comprehension part of the reading rope. So that's background knowledge. Background knowledge is not just when I knew when World War II was, it's also background knowledge, like I understand how texts work, and I understand the difference between a Petrarchan sonnet and reading a science lab report. And then vocabulary, 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 vocabulary. I cannot emphasize it enough. And it needs to be taught within our subject matters. It's a way to understand and comprehend our subject matters. Then language structure, so syntax, semantics, being able to navigate in a math textbook as opposed to being able to navigate within a memoir. And then verbal reasoning, that's where inferencing comes in. This is why we do need to teach literature in a curriculum. It's great for really developing that inferencing level of comprehension, metaphors, symbols, figurative language, all of that. And then literacy knowledge. So print concepts, text structures, that's what we're getting at. So that's basically it. That's where we're really focused. And I always indicate, I always say to fellow high school teachers in particular, when they say, well, I teach chemistry, and I'm like, yes, you teach chemistry. However, you are also teaching kids to understand, to comprehend the subject matter that you so dearly love. So one of the things that we know about this reading strand, the language comprehension part of the reading rope, is that that's a way for kids to understand the subject matter that I so dearly love, and being a content expert. So these are comprehension strategies. There's a way to understand and access text. Okay, I'm ready for the next slide.
All right, here we go.
Okay, so for our purposes today, I just want to talk about 3 levels of comprehension. Some folks would argue that there's more than that, there's 5, but I like being simple. So let's just look at these 3 because they're the big kahunas. It's literal, inferential, evaluative. Literal is I can skim the text and I can pull out the important information. Who, what, when, where in the text. Our kids in this generation, I sound like the little old lady on the park bench, this generation, they're really good at skimming. They can skim anything. Our problem is we need them to slow down and really close read a text. That's our challenge point. And then inferences are the subtext, what's not directly stated. So the text says, when I read the text, it says, the leaves were turning red and orange and there was a chill in the air. So the inference I can make is that it's fall. It's not stated explicitly, but I can infer that. And then evaluative are those big kinds of questions that we can use. So when text A and text B state this, I can make a conclusion that it's fall, or make a comparison. That is the highest level of comprehension. Notice that it looks a little like Bloomy, like Bloom's taxonomy, Marzano, Costa, DOK, whatever you guys use, you know that that's what that's leading towards, that deeper comprehension. Okay, I'm ready for the next one.
Here we go.
All right, I told you we're doing adolescent reading comprehension at the graduate level. And while I said 5 minutes, it's going to be more like 10. All right, strategies and skills. Let's talk about that for a moment. Strategies and skills are different. A lot of times it's used synonymously. This is what's most important at the middle school, high school level for our students. So strategies like things like GIST, which is a summarization strategy, sticky notes, which you're checking for comprehension, graphic organizers. You've seen all these content literacy strategies, SQ3R, SQ4R, QAR, all of those. They're really designed to support kids to learn how to summarize, because when kids know how to summarize, they're at that inferential level and evaluative level of text. They know what's important and they know what to pull out what's important. So we foisted them onto those upper levels of comprehension. And then monitoring comprehension is key. What's most important for us at middle school and high school is developing kids' executive functioning, their stamina, if you please, is that when the text gets hard, when that chemistry textbook gets hard, I know what to do. So instead of the text running circles around me, I'm running circles around that text. And that's really the key. And the other thing that I share with colleagues, you know, in the subject areas is that where do you get most of your subject matter knowledge? It's from reading. And when we all went to college and graduate school, what were we doing? We were reading all the time. And that's where you're getting so much of your information. A YouTube video can only go so far, right? So, all right, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so this is the eat this, not this segment. So these are the things that we should be focused on. Higher level questions, essential questions. I'm working with some middle school teachers, some social studies teachers in Wisconsin. And I said, you know, flip the questions. We tend to focus on the literal questions far too much. Flip it. And that's something that Think Circa does all the time. Start with the essential question. Start with the evaluative question, because all of the things that I need to know that are on the literal level, I'm going to look for that information because I need it to answer that big question. So what my social studies buddies found was that, I noticed my ring light went out. Oh, well. And is that what happens is that the kids, the teachers were concerned that they wouldn't know the nuts and bolts of the text. So they did flip it. And what they noticed was that when they did that, and put the literal questions at the very end instead, just to make sure to check that they understood everything, they said it was like the first time all year, we're in April, that the kids were actually reading the text. They had a reason to read it. You know, finding the main idea constantly, that's not to negate the importance of knowing that. But if we posit it of, hey, find the main idea and supporting evidence, that doesn't give me a reason to go into that text. That is actually to fulfill a compliance measure. But if I look at something and the essential question is, why are some stories worth telling more than others? Or how can an unexpected event lead to policy and long-lasting changes? That makes it worth reading the text. So essential questions. Then I want to talk about grade level, and there's some uncomfortableness about this. Grade level text at the instructional level. So when I'm modeling for the students, or we're going through a text, or I'm in a social studies class and we're sourcing a text, then it's grade level. If kids are working in pairs or working in small groups on a text, grade level. Independent reading level is something different. So independent is where we are going to adjust texts, differentiate texts based on reading ability, on readability. So it's not a question of, hey, the kids can't read the text, I need to give them something easier. The question is, or should I give them something easier? The question is, my kids are not understanding the text. The textbook or the text materials are too hard for them. What do I need to do to scaffold it so the kids start learning how to unlock challenging texts? That's the question we need to keep asking ourselves. And that builds executive functioning, because it's not this learned helplessness. Okay, you can't read the 7th grade level text and you're in 7th grade, so I'm going to give you something way easier at the instructional level. And then summarization, not this round robin reading. Don't get me started. You guys are going to send me into the bad place. Round robin reading is a tool of the devil. And let me just say that popcorn reading is basically round robin reading in sheep's clothing. They're awful practices, because all it does is teach kids how to, all it teaches is disfluent text, reading disfluently rather than fluently. One pagers with multiple choice questions. Those multiple choice questions tend to be on the literal level. They're not on the higher levels. One pagers don't build stamina either, I would argue. And then lower level text at the instructional level. I've been seeing a lot of that. And then, you know, when folks are looking at their benchmark assessment, we're not seeing growth. And that's exactly right. So as an ELA teacher background, social studies background, everything's a metaphor. If I engage in those kinds of things, it's like me watching, you know, a yoga class on Netflix and never getting off the couch and actually doing the yoga moves. I'm never going to have the benefits of it. I'm never going to develop the muscle memory for it. I'm never going to learn how to effectively do downward dog. So that's what we're doing, is that we keep doing that over and over and over again. So there's some really specific strategies, though, that we can use to start building that and closing that gap. Okay. All right. That took longer than I thought. I had every intention of it being 5 minutes, Eileen, but it's more of like, it wound up being like 15. So.
Oh, that's okay. I kind of want to summarize into a few themes, what we've talked about. And I'm actually going to bring us back to this slide here, because we had many of the participants, 10% of our participants on this call, and there were hundreds of people who registered and have very specific questions. Many of them do actually have to do with the middle school experience and high school experience in many cases, especially as we think about students who have had a lot of interrupted education, and particularly when students are coming in from other districts or other countries even, and perhaps speaking multiple languages, that this whole phonics and decoding and sight word recognition piece is not something that is relegated to the elementary grades. Mm-hmm. And yet often our teachers are trained in their content areas, and they aren't equipped necessarily to do this effectively. So that's sort of like one bucket of the questions that we've received. Many asked about how do we make this doable? And I want to just pause on that, because I think the other big theme that I heard recurring throughout your tutorial here for us is the idea that teachers create the context in which it's meaningful to put forth effort. Absolutely. And that's why we can never replace teachers with any kind of an app or any automated anything. We need human beings who care to create the context in which it's meaningful to put forth the effort. I heard that. One thing that you didn't say explicitly, but I think is really important to note, which is just like with students, understanding where they are on this continuum is really important because,
Mhm.
if you're, and I'll use a metaphor of something completely different, but if you're giving pizza parties for students with perfect attendance, and I have a student who, because of her family situation, cannot get to school, has a transportation issue, no amount of pizza parties is going to solve that problem for that student, right?
Yeah.
Just as no amount of making the text a simpler version is going to help teach decoding, correct? So I want to just like
Absolutely.
dive into some of the, kind of guiding principles. Teachers create the context in which it's meaningful to put forth effort, and that's about questions. It's also about the relationships and community you build. Number two, we actually have to very specifically define what the problem is. And in some cases, that's not something you have to wait around for a standardized test to do. In some
Right.
cases, it could be as simple as calling a student up to your desk, reading, discussing, et cetera, right? And then the third piece is that something we haven't talked about, and we can talk about it in our next part 2 webinar, is the challenging behavior that can occur as a result of a student being unable to meet an expectation.
Yep.
And many kids are really lucky. They can just ask for help. Others don't know what to do with that frustration and can sometimes exhibit a challenging behavior. And so we'll come back to that. But I think the same might be true for teachers, that when we're asked to do something we don't know how to do, it can be really frustrating. And so all of that context being understood, I want to move into some of the live Q&A, and then
Yeah.
we
Hey,
will return
Eileen,
to some of
somebody
the.
did have a question about, for me to clarify and define what I meant by a one pager. And a
Mhm.
one pager is usually a simplified version of a text. And I'm seeing a lot of textbook companies do this right now, where they're providing like summaries of what the whole chapter is about. And in one of my schools in particular, I'm seeing that. And those summaries are generally around a fourth grade reading level, and more in like sixth, seventh grade. And so it's way below. They're usually very simplistic. And there's usually like 4 to 5 multiple choice questions. There's a lot of platforms too. I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of platforms out there that do the same thing. And so we think we're doing a really good thing for our kids by doing those kinds of things, because it's like, oh, then, the student can read it, and that's good. But what we're doing is that we're constantly, as you said, with the pizza party and with the student, it's never going to progress them forward. So that's really, it's really problematic, because I see a lot of it. So that's what I mean by a one pager, is that they're usually short. They're usually about 4 paragraphs, and they're usually a summary to supplant the actual reading that is expected of them on grade level.
Okay, so that's a great clarification, because I think, for example, in ThinkSergo, we provide more accessible independent reading on the same topic as a
Yep,
background knowledge builder before
that's
students
different.
enter level text, and it's all authentic. But I do want to make sure we get to some of these other questions, like
Mhm.
the audio support. Can you just touch on, just like oversimplification or supplanting the challenge of reading hard text? How do you, recommend people use audio support, which can also be a helpful tool, but how do we use that to not just enable non-reading, but
Yeah.
to enable better reading?
Yeah, it's like watching the yoga class, right? So it shouldn't supplant real reading. I'm a big fan of audio support for a lot of reasons, for a lot of different situations. So for students who are English language learners, listening to audio is really helpful, because then they have multiple models for reading fluency in their new language. Also, students who have special needs. I'll give an example of my son, who has autism, and he reads at about an 8th grade level. He's now 21. So yeah, Eileen, my son's 21 now. That'll like blow her away, and almost 22. And but he is a voracious reader, but he reads on his Kindle and always uses audio support. And by doing that, he can go beyond like a 7th, 8th grade level, which is his independent reading level. And so audio support is not a bad thing, but the key word in there is support, not supplant. So if I'm one of the things that I do and is I've written a lot and have done a lot of professional development on center stations and rotations for middle school and high school. And one of the things that I recommend is listening to text, but it's in a short thing. It's like 10-15 minutes and that's it. It doesn't supplant the actual reading of the text. So,
and it can also reinforce the print to sound correspondence.
exactly.
It can certainly reinforce any learnings around decoding and word recognition, et cetera. And I think, you know, it's also really important for students to see. And I remember teaching a freshman who read the word bury as in like I buried the hatchet.
Yeah.
And it was B-U-R-Y. You know, our crazy English language can be really, really difficult to understand. And when she was hearing somebody read bury aloud and said bury, she was like, no, that's bury. And she was correcting her peer because she was decoding it as she had learned the letter use. So there, I just wanted to kind of make a case for, as you say, to support rather than supplant. Audio can be really helpful as a scaffold to keep kids at or above grade level. As opposed to rewriting things in authentic ways that make it, again, just reduce the amount of practice students have at grade level.
Richard Allington has a wonderful meta-analysis, Every Day, Every Child, and it was in educational leadership about 10 years ago. And listening to a fluent adult read aloud was one of his 6 things that he said that leads to higher achievement in reading and writing, and that's all grade levels. So listening to a fluent adult, so I can also model how I read a primary source document, how I read a math problem, but it doesn't supplant the student's reading. I model, and then they copy and do, practice and refine, independence and application. That's part of gradual release. So.
Okay. So they're not laying back with their eyes closed with the headphones on.
No,
they're actively looking at the text. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Robert Kim has a question here. How about critical, creative, and analytical reading skill development?
I'm not sure what that question means. Critical, creative, and analytical reading skill development. So if you can give me like a little bit more, like, what do you mean by that? Are we talking about like,
I think this is more like the higher order reading skills. So things that go beyond,
like in an AP class or
comprehension, but also into some of the experiences where students are doing more of the evaluative work and
I was going to say that would be on that evaluative level, right? So, and of course we want to see that at all ability levels, right? And community college classes. So like comparing between more than one text, right? So things like that I mentioned earlier, graphic organizers are really great to compare different texts and then draw a claim. So again, that essential questioning comes into play. So as a community college teacher, high school teacher, middle school teacher, all of them, if I say, why are some stories worth telling more than, or here's one for you. Here, I'll give you an example. Ironically, I did this in a middle school classroom in February 2020, and we all know what happened in March of 2020. But I was in a school in Northern Virginia, and we started with an essential question how can an unexpected event lead to long-lasting consequences? So the kids could choose between, we did one together, and it was the eruption of Mount St. Helens back in the 80s, which might as well have been the eruption of Mount Vesuvius for, 7th graders in 2020. And so we looked at that and used a graphic organizer and identified, what were the impacts of this unexpected event. One of the very cool geeky things that happened with the kids as we were looking at the text and analyzing it, they realized that there was a lot of overlap, and that if it had a political consequence, it was also probably an environmental or social one, or a social one was a direct result of environment. And then they had a choice choosing between one of the 3 areas. One was locust infestation in West Africa at the time. The second one was a garbage island and how that happened. And then the last one was this mysterious virus that seems to be circulating and spreading rapidly. And that, of course, was COVID. Little did we know. And the kids use that framework. And not only do they identify evidence, because that was the standard in the Virginia state standards, was, can the students identify the main claim or purpose in the text and supporting evidence? We went way beyond that and really looked at, because that's the literal level, the kids were foisted on that inferential and evaluative, because the question I posed was not what is the main idea in supporting evidence. We put forth the question of why are some what are the unexpected consequences, or what results from an unexpected event. And that led to a much deeper comprehension. They started comparing it between different phenomena. And so, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great. So again, just underscoring the idea that teachers create the context in which it's meaningful to put forth the effort. And part of that is asking kids questions that are worth exploring over and over again. And typically those are the essential questions that don't have an answer and are always relevant. So that's one. And then the second one that you mentioned here also is that this is about deeper learning. This is not just about reading. This is actually about creating context for deeper learning in your content area. And that's the kind of thing that allows a student to reach a level of rigor that grows their brain muscles, right? And so without engagement, you cannot get to rigor. And that content area reading is serving many purposes that go well beyond just, conveying knowledge or making sure someone can find evidence to support an answer. So that was a really great example. Thank you. And I know lots of people are going to ask for, resources. And I just want to mention again that at the end of this, if you'd like to stay on, I will show you our resources for the phonological awareness, decoding, all of that, but also the cross-curricular resources.
Those essential questions. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to just actually, again, because I don't want to with the people who took the time to give us those questions in advance, I do want to also make sure that we touch on, I would say, one of the other big buckets that I've grouped here. And this is what brought us together in the first place many years ago, which is the creating routines and centers. And so I was wondering if, and I can put up some visuals for you to talk through, but could you talk about some of your work with school districts related to the secondary and even content area literacy centers that you can set up in classrooms and routines around that? Because I think it's really helpful to break that down into practical, doable terms, because that's when you start to address the diverse gaps that we see.
Well, if you go onto my website, engaginglearners.com, there's gobs and gobs and gobs of stuff on there. And I call it literacy and learning centers, but it's really, center stations and rotations for older students, because it's going to look different than it is with little guys. And so, for full disclaimer, I ripped off everybody and made like my own model that came out of an instructional need when I was working in Western Maryland over 10 years ago. And then, also what we know of the neuroscience and how we learn, it's just a better strategy. And a lot of folks will say to me, well, I need to get them ready for college. Well, I have news for you. Learning how to work collaboratively on projects and small projects that lead to a larger one, that's actually what college is about now, and developing that executive functioning to be able to work more independently and through guided kinds of instructional experiences. But it starts with a mini lesson, so that's direct instruction. So maybe I want to, the example that I just gave to you would be a perfect example, the essential question. And then we did a mini lesson on, looking at Mount St. Helens and filling out the graphic organizer. Then the students worked in small groups, in that case, on different topics. But the other thing that you can do too is have a teacher-led center. So if you have kids who have challenges with foundational skills, that could be an opportunity for me to work with the students. Or if you have an interventionist with you too, that also is an opportunity to work with those students.
Sorry.
Yeah. And
Yeah, and
then, yeah,
I just wanted to show one of the routines because
yeah,
this is me kind of ripping you off
it's all
after
good.
all these years. But
Yeah,
these are some of our flexible
yeah,
literacy routines that support this kind of work, where if we have the resources and we have the routines, then students can actually not only work at their own pace, which is another really important part of
hmm,
reducing frustration that students might feel when they're unable to meet an expectation, because we all read at different paces. And so if I'm not done and you've now moved on, I'm struggling from there on out.
yeah,
In the stations-based rotation, whether it's actually just a step in cyberspace or it's an actual physical movement in the room, you've got opportunities to work on all of these different skills together. And, that's what it kind of really looks like. These are students that, are students who are working through those routines, but these are sort of the specific resources that can support that. And by the way, we have some little professional development 5-minute videos about how
hmm,
to set your classroom up for it, but also what happens when your classroom just does not look like that. Because we are teachers, we
yep,
know not everything goes as planned, but there's lots of ways that you can physically set it up. But I would say that the inobvious potentially solution to many of the things you just talked about is actually the way we use space and time in a class.
yes. Absolutely. And then the other thing too is that, I'm pragmatic. Eileen and I are both very pragmatic people, is that, is it something that's tenable? Can I actually implement this? And do I have the human capacity to do it? And what colleagues will tell me is, like, when they make this jump and make this shift into, small group collaborative kinds of settings like this, is it is a change. And again, it's what I said at the very beginning of changing habits, right? And what they find is that they actually cover more material, more skills, because it's so densely packed. And then the other thing too is that they always share with me too how surprised they are at how much the kids can do, and they're always surprised by that. And then, kind of a cool thing from a very nerdy perspective, is both the kids and the teachers will say to me, colleagues will say, I can't believe how fast class time goes now. And from a nerd perspective, that harkens to Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi's, who's a Hungarian psychologist, of flow theory, that when you're deeply involved and engaged in something, you lose track of time. And I hear that over and over and over again. So a lot of times, as educators, we're told, okay, we got to do this. You need to do some differentiated instruction, formative assessment, and you need to do this and this and this. How do you make it fit in the space and time that Eileen is talking about?
Yeah.
How do we maneuver our space and time? And I cannot urge you enough to start looking at this if you haven't, and taking the plunge, because it'll change your life, I'm telling you.
Well,
Better than Botox.
the other thing I would add, and again, this was where I stumbled upon, 12, 13 years ago, both Katie and I have done a lot of work with NCTE, and I stumbled upon her webinar about centers, and I started, bringing her into Chicago Public Schools to work with teachers to do these. And one of the other things that, again, is kind of addressing those big problems we talked about at the beginning, which is when you have the time, if you're not standing in front of class, leading 32 people step by step through your thoughts at your pace, etc., you actually can redeploy your time to observe the very specific challenges a student might be experiencing and know exactly what they need. You don't have to wait 10 weeks for a growth assessment to come back to know if a student actually is having a bad day and they haven't even opened the book. So of course they can't read it, right? But the other thing is that during that time, you can give feedback in real time on writing. And two, you can also build relationships and community. And I think that is one of the best parts, is that one of the things that's breaking my heart right now is all these teachers who everyone's saying is burnt out, but that fire was lit before, and we can reignite it, but we do have to make it doable for the teachers, and we have to make it doable for the kids. And so the things that you're talking about kind of address that simple simple strategy.
Mhm.
But I wanted to touch on two other questions that stood out a little bit as different from those big themes. One was about the relationship between reading and writing, if you could touch on that. And then the other one was about parent engagement, if you have any ideas there to share with people. And we'll come back to the more tactical resource related ones about, you know, phonics instruction for middle schoolers or high schoolers, those kinds of things after this. But I want to make sure we touch on those two things because we are getting the mandates. They're in the headlines. Parents
Yeah.
coming to you. You know, I want to make sure we talk about writing and its relationship to reading, and then also the parent engagement piece.
Yeah, there's so much research now, especially in the last 40 years. It was really in the 80s that the link between reading and writing was established. And every single study that we keep doing is that the amount of reading that we do, I mean, I'm sorry, the amount of writing that we do in classrooms is woefully inefficient across the board. And so as a teacher, we have to be pragmatic too of a lot of teachers will say, well, I can't give more reading because it's too much for me to grade. And basically there's a process that I think all of us need to go through and breathe that you don't grade everything that they write. And nor should you. And then of course the question is the motivation. Well, the motivation is really in that essential question, that purpose for reading, that purpose for studying. That's where it comes from. And again, I'm just going to mention the district that I'm working with in Wisconsin is that the teachers are starting to see that, especially the ELA teachers, that they've been kind of struggling with letting that go, but you have to let it go. And then also having conversations too about the cross curricular applications. And so we've had some really important conversations about that, that as a content area teacher, as a social studies teacher, I still teach writing, but I'm teaching kids how to source texts and to write about primary source documents within my field, within my area, within my subject area. So that's really important because the ELA teachers cannot do it all by themselves. Writing is a tool for kids to express what they know and understand about the content that they're learning and
Mhm.
to develop deeper understanding and deeper comprehension. When kids write about what they're learning, it leads to higher level, deeper comprehension. And so one of the things that I get in the data, there's so many studies that keep showing this over and over again, is that what we ask kids to write about in school tends to be very short, less than a paragraph, a couple of sentences, fill in the blank, and they don't know how to do it. So it's incumbent on us to be deliberate and model. We can't assume that they know, but the link between deeper comprehension, deeper understanding and reading and writing is just, drop the mic, leave the stage. It's just so explicit and clear that
Yeah.
that is key,
Yeah.
for developing critical thinkers.
And also just to like kind of put a bow on that, you know, the drafting is the deeper learning. It's also the returning to the text for the close reading. It's
Yep.
also having the productive struggle of wanting to say something and needing to find the words. And that is going back to Sandy McDonald, a wonderful retired principal here in Chicago, always says, if you can think it, you can say it. If you can say
Hmm.
it, you can write it. You can actually do that with,
Yep.
and then if you can write it, you can read it. And I remember certainly being a college student, doing my hours, my practicum hours, and being the scribe as students would talk and I would scribe, and then they would be able to read back what I had written. We have technology that can do that today, just built into your devices. You don't have to buy anything. So I wanted to point that out. The one other thing I wanted to mention here, and I want to get back to the parent question, is, and you will get all these slides, by the way, and all of these materials as a follow-up. And you will also see that right here in this slide, the how it actually looks. Somebody asked if I could see this modeled. It's in here in this video. So you just click right in the corner of that slide. And the way you can take that off and you can put your own kids' pictures in here, and boom, you have a center space rotation slide, and you can place those around the room on the whiteboard or whatever. But I wanted to just say that one of the key things here is, if you can think it, you can say it. And if your peers are engaged with you in a discussion about it, then you have a lot more to say, because you have real-time critical feedback. You don't need ChatGPT-3 to do that. You have real critical feedback from a real audience, and you are building knowledge together. It's constructivist. So so that's the writing piece. And I want to get back to the question of how we involve parents. And then I want to talk a little bit about goal setting and our results that come from some of this process. But parents.
Yeah, well, there's a bajillion, that's the technical researchy term. There's a bajillion studies about, parent involvement and literacy achievement. And, how do we support parents to support their kids? And, schools that I've seen that have been the most successful in doing that is that they just really invite parents in, as far as reading kinds of projects, writing like author kind of events, reading kind of events, book fairs. All those things matter. And I know that there's parents that are working 2 jobs sometimes, and just trying to keep the lights on and the gas on in their house. So but there is significant impact. Kids that are read to, we know that famous study, kids that are read to have a much larger vocabulary than kids who do not. They also start reading at a younger age generally than kids who do not. So it's really just emphasizing it and having that communication. The other thing too is that we also have to look at ourselves too as a school and a community. And even in middle school and high school, one of the things that I love is when there's this one school that I was working in Ohio. Every single person by their door who worked in the school, including the cafeteria staff, including the custodial staff, including the main office staff, put by their desk or their classroom what they were currently reading. And it was really funny because you always knew who was in grad school because they're reading like Introduction to Curriculum Instruction or something like that, some textbook, and they put it up there. But in this one particular school, the kids, the head custodial engineer, he kept putting up periodicals, like economic ones and like The Economist and things like that he had up. And the kids were just very interested in why Mr. Johnson kept posting these things. And it turned out he invested in stocks and things like that. And the kids were fascinated by that. But then the kids started talking about what their teachers were reading or what other staff were reading in the building. And it just made it just an environment where literacy, where reading is privileged. And so, and then there were a couple of teachers too that had posted blogs that they read all the time too, or podcasts that they listen to. So just like, bringing it out more and more and more. And so I really love that too.
Well, yeah, I think the idea of engaging, all the adults, not just parents, but all of the adults in the question of reading is a really important step in the right direction. And I think one of the other ways that I would add is just that when people set goals, they tend to, be more reflective. And so as students kind of start a new unit, having them do something like setting SMART goals. For example, like, what if your goal was, I want to like reading more? Well, how are you going to find ways to enjoy reading? Those are things when a student tells you that, you can actually do something about that. And if they're coming to school every day and they haven't had breakfast, well, maybe actually letting them go down to the cafeteria and grab some food and have the ability to eat it in class and not be arrested for that. I mean, when we have
second chance breakfast in the middle schools in particular that I've worked in, where they've implemented that, it's a game changer.
Yeah, so these are just some tools that are, again, are freely available to you. They're in every one of our circus slides. Every week we publish 10 new levels of readings, but that goal setting and relationship building. The other thing is that these are some check-ins, sort of like getting back to that specificity, that this is a script that you can use to check in with your students. And if your kids are moving through those routines, you can actually take time to ask and answer some of these questions. And then, really importantly, and something that often people don't do, is that students who are struggling, have not been successful in school, are continuously frustrated with their lack of success because they really want nothing more than to do what you're asking them to do, truly. Because think how difficult life is when they can't. And they really do want to lead, live up to that expectation, but sometimes they don't know when they're making progress, and you have to truly reflect that back to them, and give them an opportunity intentionally to reflect on their learning and to celebrate success, and to also understand what are the obstacles that they have had, and help them strategize about how to overcome them. And so we have some other slides in this deck that I'll just share. But one of the things is about really building community. There's some other little strategies that you can use about creating the context in which it's meaningful to put forth the effort. There's some resources about aligning your curriculum across the board around literacy, and some templates for that. But one of the things that I think is really important is to, again, just like with students, don't give them a task that is undoable and then be
Yeah.
mad at them if they can't do it, right? And I know that
Amen.
as administrators, we are really empathizing with the challenges and recognizing the needs our teachers have just as much, but we can't match our empathy with the time that we would like to give people. So we're trying more and more just to have some on-demand point of use things, but that empathy-driven design is really key. And so, helping teachers actually start to define their space and their time with empathy for their students' needs. There's a helpful TED Talk in there about design empathy. And then there's, kind of somebody was asking, can I see these routines and actions? There you go. This is about setting up expectations for students so that they know how to do them. And then again, some of those sample cycles, those slides. But again, setting the clear expectation for the students or teachers, setting up, training for the routines, and then making a plan for what happens if it doesn't go as you planned. Surprise, surprise. But this is where you want to identify those continuous improvement areas. So were your expectations unclear for the kids, or whatever it was. But I had to throw in a little board teachers because he's hilarious. And so anyway, those are all like at your fingertips, and so feel free to grab those and modify them and share them. And somebody else asked, is this going to be recorded and shared? And absolutely. And guess what? This wasn't even the practical classroom application version. Part 2 is coming up in a little bit. You'll be getting a link to register for the part 2, which is really about implementing the classroom strategy, where we'll talk more about the secondary literacy for, the phonics instruction, for example, the resources ThinkCirca has, the other resources for all sorts of literacy resources that you have access to across the board. But I wanted to just kind of right then in right here in our library, just show the many resources that you have, and the searchability of that as well, and all of the scaffolds. But if anyone who is on this call wants to stay around, I'm happy to walk you through some of those resources. And if anyone is ready to drop off, please know that number one, we're available to do one-on-one or team meetings with you to walk you through those resources. But number two, and probably even more excitingly, and I know that Katie, your calendar gets packed up pretty quickly every year. So if you are interested in working with Katie, you can certainly reach out directly to Katie or through us, and we will be putting you in touch and putting her contact information in a follow-up on our next webinar. actually, which is next week, which is about summer school. We're going to be talking very specifically about implementing foundational literacy routines in summer school, and we have some special plans for that. And then we have the part 2 of this series, which will be focused on practical strategies for the implementation of, all of the practices we just talked about. And, again, continue to visit our blogs, continue to look for our resources. Many of them are freely accessible, and we're really, happy to have you here. Really appreciate the time, Katie, and also the busy educators who took the time to join the call and share their wonderful questions. So thank you, everyone. This was just great. And I look forward to part 2. And if anyone would like to stay on, I'm happy to share more about Think Circa and our results, which, many people think of us as a writing resource. But, the funny thing is, as Katie pointed out, our growth is often measured in terms of reading. And that's because there's a very close and strong link. And so one of the reasons why we have the levels of evidence for us that we have is because we show about 2 years of reading growth in a single year of fidelity of implementation with fidelity, which was much greater than the other products, which were often focused on rote reading at other levels.
Literal level. Yeah.
And also just answering multiple choice questions in a cubicle by yourself. That's not the context in which it's meaningful to put forth the effort either. But also, of course, the gains in writing that come not just from writing to improve learning, but also writing to improve learning, as Katie talked about. And we do have just, this final note about the upcoming May 24th reading gap and how we can close it, tactics for implementing foundational literacy routine 612, where we're going to really go into detail on how we do that.